Spanish reflexive verbs. Today we're going to look at Spanish reflexive verbs and ask ourselves some important questions. For example, who is doing the verb and which reflexive pronoun do I need? Our aims are as follows: to learn what a reflexive verb is and to learn how to form regular and irregular reflexive verbs. Firstly, the question, what is a reflexive verb? Some verbs have a little pronoun between the subject, the person doing the verb, and the verb itself. They're called reflexive verbs because the pronoun reflects the subject. In other words, the verb reflects back on the person doing it. Think about the verb to wash. For example, you can wash a car, or you can wash yourself, i.e. have a wash. Or the verb to get dressed, or to dress oneself. When you get dressed, you are dressing yourself, hence why this verb is reflexive. Let's look at the verb lavarse, to wash oneself. Me lavo, I wash myself. Te lavas, you wash yourself. And se lava, he or she washes himself or herself. As verbs, they follow the same patterns as other verbs in the same group, i.e. AR, ER, and IR. It is only the presence of the reflexive pronoun that makes them different. Look at the examples above. The me, te, and se all represent the words myself, yourself, and himself or herself, although you may not use these when you translate them into English. For the purpose of today's lesson, we're going to assume that the learner has a knowledge of present tense regular verbs in Spanish and therefore understands the endings and how they work. If you haven't seen that lesson already, you can go back and watch it again, obviously. First, let's look at the full version of a present tense reflexive verb. Let's look at levantarse, to get oneself up. Me levanto, I get up, as in I get myself up. Te levantas, you get up. Se levanta, he or she gets up. Nos levantamos, we get up. Os levantáis, you plural get up. And se levantan, which is they get up. Notice how in the purple we have the reflexive pronoun, and then in the present tense we have the endings as well that you would have for an AR verb. O, ASA, amos, ais, an. And notice as well, when the verb changes from the infinitive to the present tense, the se disappears. And once the se at the end of levantarse disappears, you're basically left with a regular verb. It's only that reflexive pronoun at the end of the infinitive that makes it different. Now copy this verb down and then conjugate these other verbs that follow exactly the same pattern. Lavarse, to wash or to have a wash. Ducharse, to get showered or have a shower. Peinarse, to brush as in hair. And preguntarse, to wonder, which literally translates as to ask oneself. Pause the recording now and do that. Now we're going to look at quite a tricky part of Spanish, stem changing verbs. You're already familiar with Spanish verbs in the present tense, but stem changing verbs are a group of verbs that are also called root changing or radical changing verbs. This simply means that their spelling changes in the stem or the main part of the verb. The spelling changes usually happen in the present tense, although they can happen in other tenses as well. The most common stem changes are E to IE, e.g. entender, to understand, which changes to IE, entiendo, I understand, and O to UE, e.g. poder, to be able to, puedo, I can. Jugar, to play, is another stem changing verb. This is the only verb that changes from U to UE, e.g. jugar, to play, and then juego, I play. There is no change in the nosotros, nosotras, and vosotros, vosotras forms in the present tense. There is a separate lesson on a whole range of stem changing verbs, but for the purpose of this lesson we will only focus on some of the key reflexive verbs. Let's start with one that changes E to IE, despertarse, to wake up. Notice how once the SE, the reflexive pronoun, has gone from the end of the verb, you're left with a more familiar ending, which is an AR. But remember, this is a stem changing verb, so let's see how it changes. Me despierto. Te despiertas. Se despierta. Nos despertamos. Os despertáis. Se despiertan. So here we have I wake up, you wake up, he, she or you formal wakes up, we wake up, you plural wake up, and they wake up or you formal plural wake up. Notice how the actual endings are still the same as regular verbs, and it's only the stem that's changed, except in the nos and os form, the we and you plural. This is the same for all stem changing verbs. You'll only see the first three and the last one that change. So copy this verb down, and then if you want, try the challenge on the right. See if you can conjugate this verb, which follows the same pattern as despertarse, sentarse, which means to sit. Or even harder, if you want a real challenge, see if you can do divertirse, which is to enjoy oneself or have fun. Now this one's harder because it's an IR verb, so you have to think back to how the IR endings are different and then make the changes accordingly. Now let's look at a verb that changes E to I. Vestirse, to get dressed. Notice how the SE disappears, the reflexive pronoun, and then you're left with vestir, which is the verb to dress. But because the SE at the end, it means dress oneself. Here we see the E changes to an I. Me visto, te vistes, se viste. Nos vestimos, os vestís, se visten. Notice how the E to I change has only occurred in the first three and the last one, with nos and os staying the same. And the actual endings are still the same as regular verbs in the IR. And the actual endings are still the same as regular verbs that end in IR. It's only the stem that's changed. Okay, see if you can now copy down that verb, which should be easy enough. And then if you want, try the challenge on the right, which is to conjugate this verb, which follows the same pattern as vestirse, which is despedirse, which means to say goodbye. Pause the recording and do that now. Okay, let's now look at a verb that changes in the stem from O to U, acostarse, to go to bed. Notice how once the reflexive pronoun disappears off the end of the infinitive, you are left with an AR verb, so expect the endings to be the same. Me acuesto, te acuestas, se acuesta. Nos acostamos, os acostáis, se acuestan. Notice how the endings are the same as AR verbs, and you have the reflexive pronoun there as well. It's only that stem that has changed from O to U. So copy this verb down, and then if you want a challenge, try the green box on the right, where you can try and conjugate a verb that follows the same pattern as acostarse, which is recordarse, to remember. Pause the recording and do that now. Here we see a reminder of how the Spanish reflexive verbs work. You have your reflexive pronoun first, me, te, se, nos, os, se. Then you have your stem, which is the infinitive of the verb, the one you find when you look in a dictionary, minus the last four letters. Now in the present tense, you've normally seen it minus the last two letters, but remember that extra se at the end is the reflexive pronoun, and that also needs to go as well. That will leave us with the stem. Then you have your regular endings that you would do for AR, ER and IR verbs, as you can see on the right hand side. Here are some examples. Me levanto, I get myself up. Se viste, he or she gets herself or himself dressed. Nos acostamos, we go to bed, or we take ourselves to bed. Now see if you can match up the reflexive pronouns on the left with the correct translation on the right. Pause the recording, complete the activity, and then mark your work. And if you get it wrong, correct your answer so you can learn from your mistake. Pause the recording now and see how you get on. Me, myself. Te, yourself, singular. Se, himself or herself. Nos, ourselves. Os, yourselves, plural. And se, which is themselves. How did you get on? If you made any mistakes, just correct them so you can make sure that you learn from your mistake. Now, as we've said before, the main difference with reflexive verbs is the presence of the reflexive pronoun. Look at the endings of the following verbs below and decide on the correct reflexive pronoun that you've just matched up in the activity before. Only use the verbs you've copied down, though, to help you if you need to. For example, numero uno, lavo. Now, if you look at that ending, O, that tells you a lot about the verb. It tells you it's the I form of the verb in the present tense. So therefore you know if it's I, it's going to be myself. So the answer is me lavo. I wash myself. Right, pause the video, complete the activity and then self-mark your work. And remember, if you get it wrong, it is important to correct your answer so you can learn from your mistake. Número 2. Se despierta. He or she wakes up. 3. Nos levantamos. We get up. Número 4. Os vestís. You, plural, get dressed. Número 5. Te duchas. You shower. Número 6. Me acuesto. I go to bed. Número 7. Número 7. Se prepara. He or she prepares himself or herself. Número 8. Se peinan. They brush their hair. How did you get on? Remember to correct your mistake. Now translate the following verbs into English. Remember, when you look the verb up, you will see the infinitive with se at the end of the infinitive. This indicates that it is reflexive. This means you'll need to look a little bit earlier in the verb to find out exactly what it is that you need to translate. Por ejemplo, número 1. Se lava. He or she washes himself or herself. Pause the video now and complete the activity and then self-mark your work. And remember, if you get it wrong, correct your answer so you can learn from your mistake. Número 2. Nos despertamos. We wake up. Número 3. Se viste. He or she gets dressed. Número 4. Me acuesto. I go to bed. Número 5. Te duchas. You get showered. Número 6. Se levantan. They get up. Número 7. Me peino. I brush my hair. Número 8. Se despierta. He or she wakes up. How did you get on? Just double check your work and make sure you haven't made any mistakes, but if you have, just correct them. Look up the following verbs in a dictionary. You will see the words ending in AR, ER or IR, plus the reflexive pronoun se at the end. That will tell you which ending to add, and use the reminder on the right to help you if you need to. Por ejemplo, número 1. Yo me peino. As you can see, because it's I, brush, myself, therefore you need the O for the I ending. Pause the recording now and complete the activity and then mark your work. And remember, if you get it wrong, correct your answer so you can learn from your mistake. Número 2. Se viste. He gets dressed. Número 3. Nos acostamos. We go to bed. Número 4. Ellas se despiertan. So they wake up. Número 5. Vosotras os ducháis. You, plural, shower. Número 6. Te vistes. As in, you get dressed. How did you get on? Make sure you correct your work if you have made any mistakes. So today we've looked at Spanish verbs and particularly focusing on reflexive verbs. We've looked at who is doing the verb and which reflexive pronoun we need to use. Our aims were to learn what a reflexive verb is, and it was also to learn how to form regular and irregular reflexive verbs. Muy bien. Adiós.